Well, hi y'all. We are at our closing panel, which I'm going to tell you is going to be fantastic, and we get to sit in on this amazing discussion. Um, these people who you're going to meet, who are going to introduce themselves, are all leaders who thought deeply about issues of race, justice, equity, and acted on that understanding to make changes in their communities and our communities. Um, so I'm just going to hand it off to them, and I thank them for contributing to our greater understanding and just set you in motion. And I'm just going to hand it off to Corey Best, who's going to, well, I don't know, maybe I'm not. I'm going to hand it off to Ty. Corey Best is going to facilitate, and I think we'll give him the opportunity to kick off.
Absolutely. Thank you, Roger, and everyone for joining us. We have planned a really invigorating and hopefully uplifting conversation today with four esteemed, I call colleagues and comrades in this space because I have read and have gotten an opportunity to feel their spirit and energy around racial and social justice. Before I go any further, as a male moderator, I have to be really mindful of my one relationship to power and also how my identity can be oppressive. So patriarchy is a legacy of the system of inequities, and I want to really really bring to the table here that we have been intentional about co-designing uh, a panel, a conversation for you that minimizes the power and oppression at the intersection of race and gender. So it's incumbent upon me to really bring that into this space, and I also hope that um, identifying men who identify as male understand that dynamic in this bucket of work, right? So we're encouraging today truth telling, commitment to non-closure, embracing the paradox. Let's lean into the learning and to each other, and we're going to co-design a liberated and actually a brave space. So some of you have joined the workshop earlier, but today we're going to see how individuals sort of grapple and deal and advance and resist systems of inequities, building from the legacy of theft of land into anti-Blackness, the legacy of slavery. We'll have a conversation about immigration, racist immigration policies, how that has impacted Mexican Americans through radical in these United States, radical exclusionary policies and the role of whiteness, power, and economic exploitation. So what we've designed today is to really unpack the importance of how history has more to do with the present than it does the past. We'll take a historical and contemporary analysis through each of our panelists' lived experience and their views, their worldviews of the system of racial inequities and how it manifests itself at multiple dimensions: institutional, interpersonal, and internalized. This is going to require, collective thinking, resilience, and humanity. And we'll hear narrative through storytelling, lived experience again, and the observations made in each individual's quest to advance racial and social justice. We hope to model for you as well effective ways to have what we like to call, or Daryl Wing Sue likes to call, race talk that promote change and collective movement. The human side of why race matters is also a critical element of today's conversation. So without further ado, I really want to give as much of my attention, all of my attention actually, to the panelists, and they will have an opportunity to introduce themselves. And each of our leaders are community leaders, organizers, activists, influencers within their own spheres. And I'd like to just kick off with asking Ty, one, what is holding, if anything, is holding your attention before, after you introduce yourself? And also, why is racial justice important to you and what is the role, what role has history played in your development? And that is for all panelists as we think about making meaning of the conversation today.
Thank you, Katiaya. Inim unik dwas atit watit. My name is the storyteller. In was nimi puayet. I am a citizen of the Nez Perce Nation. Inim nexasa hiwis timina ilp kanich. I am a descendant of Chief Red Heart of the Nez Perce Nation. Laloits that kinna. I'm happy to be here with you all. I am a social change advocate with the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. I am also a co-founder of the Indigenous Idaho Alliance, and I'm here in the capacity of probably a little bit of both. My work tends to straddle professional and personal spheres of my life, especially racial justice, social justice, activism, etc. I introduced myself in my Indigenous language as an homage to honor the elders who've lost lives and my ancestors who've lost lives so that I could exist and be here. It's a very powerful assertion, political assertion that we make as Indigenous people. And I would very quickly like to acknowledge that I'm broadcasting from the territory of the Niwa and Numu nations that we commonly call Shoshone Bannock, Paiute, Yakima, and Shoshone Bannock, Paiute, Yakima nations. Okay, that was all of them. Sorry. And if you are somewhere else in Idaho, you are on Chichuamsh or Coeur d'Alene land, Nimipu or Nez Perce land, or Kootenai land as well. So I just want to make that quick acknowledgement for us this afternoon or this morning. Let's see, you know, what's holding my attention is such a great question. I mean, if you are paying attention to the news at any given point in time, there is something racially charged and or violent. We'll talk about the anti-Asian rhetoric that's taking place, I'm sure, when it comes to the loss of lives at the spa back east. And naming it what that is a hate crime. I also like to acknowledge my frustration and anger around what's taking place at Boise State, even in real time, that, you know, we are buckling under the pressure of anti-intellectualism. We're buckling under the pressure of racism as it, you know, is couched in our institutions. This is what we call institutionalized racism, where we are doing our best to instill an anti-racism practice. We are doing our best to make sure that the voices of those most impacted by marginalization and racism are heard. I would encourage all of you to read the Idaho Statesman article about what's taking place, and even some of the blogs and posts of other social justice activists in the community. And, but at the same token, multiple truths can exist, right? So while at one point as a Black and Indigenous woman, I hold rage and pain and anger and frustration, on the same side, there's always something to celebrate. Deb Haaland is now the first ever Indigenous woman Secretary of the Interior. As many of you know, historically, since we're taking a historical lens today, the Secretary of Interior, the Department of Interior, was entirely built to colonize, displace, and dispossess Indigenous folks of their land, and has since been just a consultation liaison body between the president and the Native American nations of this community, of our nation, of this country. So to now have an Indigenous woman representing these Native nations is very powerful, very exciting, and maybe a pivot in the way that we have operated in the Department of Interior since the beginning of time. And so those are that's the blending of all of the emotions, of holding all of the pain and the rage and the celebration and the joy. You know, why is this important to me? You know, what may look and sound like activism to those of you who are not familiar is actually survival to me. I'm an Indigenous person, so my social justice work is about ensuring that my language survives, that my culture survives, that my people have descendancy, that Black folks are liberated, and that Indigenous folks, their sovereignty is asserted. So that's why it's important to me. And all of it, you know, is based on this. Racism is this engine that built this country on stolen land and with the blood of Black folks, displaced Indigenous Africans, you know, so Indigenous is Indigenous worldwide. So I will continue to be a champion for truth and justice, love, equity, because those are the things that I want to be honored for as an ancestor by my descendants. So in short, this is me honoring my ancestors. This work does, while at the same time hoping that I'm worthy of my descendants into the future. And, you know, ultimately the goal is that I don't that I can do this work, that the next generation can do this work, so that 7 and 8 generations down the road, nobody has to do this work, that we're thriving, that we are all enjoying equity and love and truth in a very meaningful and powerful way, and that this work, social justice work, racial justice work, is no longer relevant, just something that they study in school. So that's my rant. I'm sticking to it this morning. And then really quick, I'll answer the last portion. What role has history played? History is also an engine. It is a process, it is an experiment, and it's how we see colonization play about across generations. It's how we see displacement, dispossession, marginalization play out across generations. And that's why we have to look to history to understand current context. There is nothing new in racial or social justice right now. What we're doing is trying to dismantle and unweave this tapestry of systemic and institutional and individual racism, oppression, etc. And it's complicated work. It's heavily nuanced work, but understanding history clearly and honestly and with courage, because nobody wants to look back on this painful, sordid history. But if we look back on it with courage, we can find where we went wrong, where we need to pivot, and whose voices need to be at the center of this work. So in my opinion, that's the role that history plays in this development. So thank you for those questions, and I'll pass it to one of my comrades here that comes next.
Absolutely. What a way to start. I'm just going to go right to Whitney.
Hi, I'm Whitney. Happy to be with you guys today. My pronouns are she and her. So I'm pretty new to this work in comparison to folks like Ty, for example, who is from Idaho and has been doing this work and is well known. And so one of the things I do is Inclusive Idaho. I'm the ED of that organization and the co-founder. I also started a candle company recently called Equity Candle Co. And built and based on the idea that we can produce a quality product that elevates and advances equity within our community and abroad. And I work in DEI strategy and I speak, and I'm really excited to be with you guys today again. So that's just a little bit about me. Today I'm holding a lot of things. I am also frustrated about the recent decision from Boise State. I sit on their Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Blue Sky Institute Advisory Committee. And it's very disheartening. It makes the work that we do in that committee feel really tough. It makes the work that we're doing in that committee feel non-productive. And I am mostly, and not mostly, but more highly concerned because it's super important in order for us to get to an anti-racist society, in order for racial justice, racial equity to be important to the masses. We have to be creating an educated workforce and educated young folks who understand what it's like to work and live and join together with folks who come from different backgrounds and experiences. And if we're not doing that in higher education, it's really troubling. So I'm holding that today. I'm holding that we're just a few days beyond a year since Breonna Taylor was killed, and our progress has been pretty small and just a trickle there. And I am also holding the mass shooting that happened yesterday. Just recently, I was able to sit down in a one-on-one conversation with Sue Chu. Sue is an Asian woman who is an Idaho state representative. And I actually got to ask her about the anti-Asian, anti-Chinese rhetoric. And if you have a chance to watch that conversation, you can skip to the end and hear her answer. But it was so beautiful, and to get that news yesterday, to see that, to hear her frustrations online, and my friends who identify as Asian was really, really tough. And so I'm holding all those things today and trying not to be discouraged in the work and in what we're doing. And then what role has history played? Everything. And so why we are here, why we're in this conversation today, why the work that we're doing, all of the things that we're trying to dismantle or change, or the voices that we're working to elevate are totally and completely in occurrence because of our past. And so if history was different, racial justice and racial equity would likely not be a thing. right? And so all of the things that we're doing and the things that we're learning are from the fact that we spent a large bulk of our time as a country systematically dismantling languages, other races, and all non-white. And now we're spending all of our time trying to correct our wrongs. And so to me, history is everything. When I think about the role that it plays, and it does play much more of a role, much more of a role now than it did in past. I'll leave it there.
Thank you for that. Mika?
Hello, buenos dias. My name is Micaela Rios. You can call me Mika, as Corey referred to me as. I work at the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. And I also just come up from a line of strong matriarchs in our family who have tried to advance and have worked to advance racial justice throughout several generations. And I come from a mixed Mexican-American family where my great grandma and my grandma have all worked in some form or fashion in racial equity, and my strong mother in her own way, in her own capacity, being a leader in our Latino community here in a small town in Idaho, 2 hours away east of Boise. So I was born and raised in Burley, Idaho, and speaking up to the question about what role of history has played in my development, you know, the history that we learned in the small town of Burley, Idaho is not the history that I wish I would have learned. And I really learned the history just by lived experiences and by the histories and the stories that my grandma and my mom would tell us, and the inequities that they would experience. And I just felt a huge disconnect between what my family and what we were experiencing to what we were reading in books at school, in a very predominantly white, small town in Idaho. And I thought something is off here. What's happening? And so I think that history is so important to teach the right history to our children. And as a mom now, as a parent, it's my responsibility. It's my role to teach the right history. And so to understand why these huge disconnects are happening between our lived experiences and what we're reading. And so I also just come here with like a lot of the pain, a lot of the frustration with what's happened at BSU, just right down the street from where I currently live at. And you know, like this post-racial question that we have in this forum today, or in this conversation, in this talk, I think I'm feeling a lot, and I'm bringing into this space everything that we've been experiencing in the last 4 years. It feels like we're always on survival mode. And so it hasn't been time to like rest. There hasn't been time to heal. There hasn't been time to like really decompress what our bodies have been holding for a solid 4 years. I mean, of course, throughout the existence of people of color's lives in this country, but in the past 4 years, I just feel like I'm just holding it, and it's weighing heavy on my chest. And so like really trying to find ways in which I can release that so I can do this work better.
Thank you for that. A common theme that history has more to do with the present than it does the past, right? And that the trauma of oppression is real and tangible. So that takes us to Julie.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Julie Stevens. I work for Casey Family Programs here in Idaho. Been a supervisor there for a while. Prior to coming to Casey, I worked in public child welfare in Region 1. So I've spent my whole career in child welfare. So I'm also holding all of what my co-panelists have talked about today in terms of the tension related to that. So I want to name that. But I think I'm here today because I want to be accountable for the privileges I hold, especially my white privilege. I don't consider myself a leader in this area, but I have been on a journey to be better and to do better for a really long time, dating back to when I was probably a kid and began to notice the differences in how I was treated compared to my brown and black people in the community. So I'm on a quest to learn all I can in order to be better and to share that with other white people with whom I come in contact with, from my own 3 daughters and family to my colleagues and in the community where those exchanges I benefit from as well. I certainly have had and continue to have conversations with my own daughters that were never had with me. And I do believe that that's changing the trajectory, at least from my sphere of influence, in terms of the future generations that will come after me, and just in terms of all the people that my daughters are touching. My kids are starting at a completely different place than I did with their knowledge and skills. I've had to work really hard to get to this place, and I certainly have not arrived. It does require having the courage to engage in uncomfortable conversations, being wrong, being accountable for my impact, being accountable for the impact of all white people, because in my mind, I can't separate the privileges that I hold from the blood that exists on my hands as a white person. They are a package deal when you look at racism from a historical and a current perspective. So I want to live in a world, and I want my children and grandchildren to live in a world where racism doesn't exist at the personal, interpersonal, institutional, or cultural levels. So I believe I need to do all I can now to influence change in that direction and for future generations. I think one of the most powerful books I've read about history is The People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, which I wasn't even exposed to until I was in graduate school in the 90s. So up to that point, that is not the history I was taught. And this book was just recently offered as a supplemental reading in an AP history class that my daughter was taking at Capitol High School. So I just bring that up to say that accurate history is still not being taught. And white fingerprints are all over the most horrific atrocities that have been committed. And we are not talking about or educating our children about those horrors and how they have led us to where we are today, to the extent that we should be.
Thank you all. I mean, again, just so elated to be in the same space with you. Before we pivot to a deeper conversation to really sort of unpack some of the legacies, there are a few cautions, I think is the best word for me to use in this space. When you hear a term, whiteness, white supremacy, it's up to you to internalize that as if it means you or not, right? There may be some opportunity for you to ask yourselves deeper questions. Another thing that I would encourage us in this space is to refer back to our process norms, right? Just leaning in, listening. One thing that will not get us to justice is comparing traumas. This happened to me. That's how I felt. Me too, right? That's not going to get us to justice. It's co-optive, and it also dismisses the experiences of these 4 panels right here, 4 panelists for sharing their vulnerability, their experiences. So my encouragement is to take the lessons today and find nuggets of gold and determine how you may be able to take what you hear today and travel on your own journey to exploration. Because the simple fact, and it's data to support this, is we are a racialized country, right? And it's unfortunate that we have these bookends, and oppression and racial disparities are looking the same across all systems, regardless of what system we're in. And this is just an opportunity for us to really understand from leaders that are within your reach, you know, how they experience it, how they continue to thrive and overcome all of the adversity stacked up against them. And I want us to realize that even if we start again, some of you heard this a little while ago, but if it's only 56 years since we've been in legalized Jim Crow, like 56 years. It's not a long time. And so I want to start with Ty again and sort of give a why how we've structured this part of the conversation. Begins with the theft of land, right? So the colonization in your state. I believe it's Shoshone and Nez Perce, correct, Ty? And I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, right? And so
We'll get you there.
and so we begin to think about questions like, why is Idaho so white? If Americans or Americanas was Native Indigenous individuals, right? What happened to structure us in this way? And we begin with the legacy of theft of land, and then we'll build on that to the legacy of Jim Crow and slavery, and also weave in how immigration policies sort of came to play in about 1790. We're not going to go through a history lesson. We hope that you will take these legacies and do some work on your own. That would be an action, that would be a task. And then we're also going to wrap up and hear from Julie from a white body perspective, how these legacies, and as she said, white fingerprints everywhere, how she experiences also a system of inequities from a white perspective and in a progressive institution even. So let's begin with Ty. So Ty, we've heard about the Indian Removal Act and Trails of Tears. But you know what, Ty? I'm gonna play an advocate. I don't want to say devil's advocate, but man, that was like the past. Like that happened in 1830, right? Like, what does that have to do with today? So, one, I want to know how that's impacted and still impacting you, your people, your peoples, and describe the resilience factor to keep showing up, right, in the face of whiteness to fight this battle.
Indigenous people have literally written the book on resilience. And I love to see it day in and day out. I see it in my own nieces. I see it in myself, in the face of whiteness under stress, very often in social justice movement work. So thank you for the question. Let's start with the context of history, right? So real briefly, Indian Removal Act, Trail of Tears was essentially state-sponsored violence against Native American communities across the nation for the purpose of resource extraction, agriculture, capitalist gain. There's nobody in the history of historians that could argue that the United States, as we know it, has come at the cost of Indian removal, forced displacement, dehumanization, marginalization, et cetera. And it was done very violently. When we hear about Indian removal and the Trail of Tears, the things that they don't talk about was how targeted those were against children, elders, and women. 70% of indigenous nations in the United States are matriarchies. So in order to enact Indian removal and settler colonialism, they had to target the women in each of these communities in order to destabilize these communities. When women were no longer in power, when women were no longer able to care for their people, the communities crumble, and we're seeing the adverse effects of that still to this day. The way that manifests today, higher than normal rates of racism in healthcare for Native American women, higher than normal rates and even of COVID. The COVID impacts on Native American communities is very high. You can give that a Google. I don't need to go into too much detail there. And we have 5,700 missing and murdered 5,700 just missing Indigenous women across the continental United States as we know it. That number is exponentially higher when we include Alaska and Canada as well. And then the femicide that's taking place in Mexico. Indigenous, like I said that again, Indigenous is Indigenous worldwide. I'm speaking mostly to what we understand as Native Americans in the United States, but it's still an adverse impact of Indian removal and the Trail of Tears. Fast forward a little bit. So after Indian removal, we were removed to Indian reservations. The common misconception now is an Indian reservation is just this cute little space that's flourishing and thriving Native American communities, when that's not the case. Reservation systems are prisons. Reservations are prisons. I cannot say that loud. Reservations are prisons. They were not meant to be the most resourceful, beautiful chunks of land and territory that we had previously occupied. They are very remote, they are very rural, and we were often left without access to our ancestral gathering and hunting places, and also our weapons for gathering and hunting were removed from us. So it was about starvation, it was about actual removal and dehumanization from lands that we had occupied for nearly 15,000 years. Fast forward a little bit then to the mission systems and boarding schools, where it was an act of state-sponsored acculturation and assimilation designed to remove all of the cultural pieces and language pieces and spiritual pieces of who we are as Indigenous people, and replacing it with whiteness, Christianity, capitalism, servitude, what else? English speaking. And this is how many of our languages were lost. I have a very tumultuous relationship with Christianity. I am not Christian, but I am thankful that some of the women, elders, ancestors of our community who, what's the word I'm looking for, converted into Christianity, did it in a way that kept our language through this process of assimilation and acculturation as well. And then we fast forward a little bit more into the forced sterilization of Indigenous women. Yes, that did take place. That was also state sanctioned, where Native women, anytime they went in for any pregnancy, their first pregnancy, anytime they went in for vaccinations, anytime they went to see a doctor in the Indian health system, they were also sterilized and prevented from having further children. These are acts of genocide according to the United Nations. So there's no mincing words in this. And it wasn't until 1976-ish was our last recorded forced sterilization. So that's within the lifetime of many of you here and right before I was born. So none of these things, like we talk about things that happened back in the 1830s, but it's this continued and compounded traumatic series of state-sanctioned violence against Native Americans in this country that we feel very acutely now. We feel it in our diet, we feel it in our economy, we feel it in our school system, in our family, in our life ways. But the resiliency of who we are is so powerful. We have such a deep tie and interconnectedness to nature, and I believe it's that spiritual connection, our language connection, and our connection to each other that helped us navigate some of these horrible and horrific traumas that happened to us. And we still do it. When we come together for name givings, when we come together for coming of age ceremonies, when we come together for powwow and for longhouse and for spiritual practice, we talk about all the time, like, these horrible things happen to us, but let's celebrate how strong and how powerful we are because we survived and how we made it through. We have the practice and a word, himuma, our connection to each other. Wayakin, our connection to nature, Waptis, our connection in spirituality, like all of those things, like the words in our language are so much bigger than English because it's always about connection to each other and the way that we serve and protect one another. And those are the things that could not be taken care that could not be assimilated out of us, which makes me very proud and makes me very dedicated to continue this work that my ancestors were doing. So again, much of this work in response to dehumanization, dispossession, displacement, isn't necessarily about acknowledging, or it is about acknowledging the historical impact, how that looks contemporarily, and how we all of us, all full caps, all of us benefit from that dispossession, that violent removal, the violent migration that took place. We all benefit from that now. And so not only remembering those acts, but taking steps to ensure that we're having these very honest conversations so that it doesn't happen again. What's happening in the immigration centers at the borders is not new. Like, it has happened. It has been a practice enacted upon Native Americans in this country for a very, very long time. So I could keep going and digging deeper into that, but I hope that painted a picture of where we're at historically, how what happened historically to Native Americans affects us still to this day. It It was state sanctioned. It is a practice deeply embedded in our systems of healthcare, education, into our churches, into our governing systems. And the practice now is to be actively anti-racist, active towards building equity and justice, so we can dismantle those things and allow Indigenous people to thrive in a way that's culturally, has been culturally appropriate for 15,000 years. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Ty. And so I'll just, quickly pivot to Whitney and really just uplift what you have stated. To me, and I've heard, this isn't a blanket statement, but patriarchy, capitalism, theft of land are like the conjoined triplets that leads to this other form of barbaricism here in these United States, which is the legacy of slavery. So if we're following along in a linear way, if need be, what we're attempting to do is not only reveal oppressive tactics, occurrences, but it's also an attempt, and this is what makes it really uncomfortable. This is an examination of whiteness, right? So I don't know how to mince words about that. It's no way I can mince words about that. If we invented race to say that somebody, a group of people, were superior, and if we used violent tactics by Europeans and we capitalized off that, and that were people who were then known as elites who then became white, I don't know how else to say it. My grandmother repeats W.E.B. Du Bois by saying, a system cannot fail, and this leads to Whitney, a system cannot fail those who it was never meant to protect. So Whitney, my question to you is through the lens of pro-Blackness and also anti-Blackness, right? And the legacy of slavery, how did individually or personally, I should say, how did the legacy of slavery, or how does the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and de jure segregation impact your life as a human being?
Corey, yeah, thank you for that question. So just to start a little bit about what anti-Blackness is, and I'll just use a few words and say a little bit and then go into how slavery, legalized segregation, and Jim Crow impacted my life. But we are existing and living right in a space, in a nation that was built for white people by Black people. That's the simplest, easiest way to say it. And anti-Blackness now is a million words, and some of them that come to mind is colorism and police brutality, slavery, but this idea that Black people are less, right? And that our skin color is a direct correlation to us being considered less or being treated less. But I'm gonna start with story a little bit. And I'll reveal my age in this and a lot more about me than probably any of the folks on this call know. I'm 29 and I'm adopted. The woman that raised me was born in 1935. The woman that raised her was born in 1904. The house I grew up in had pictures on our walls of family who lived their lives as sharecroppers. There aren't many people my age that can say that. But the reality of that means that the woman who raised me was able to give me firsthand life and story and experiences of what it was like to not only be born in the Great Depression, right in the middle, but born in the Great Depression as a Black woman in the South with 11 other siblings and poor. And her mother was raised in 1904. So her story, even beyond the woman who raised me, is, even as a Black woman in America, is unimaginable for me to understand what she went through. but I was adopted by a Black woman into a Black family. But the kicker here is that we integrated the town I grew up in. And so when you ask me, how does the legacy of slavery, the legacy of Jim Crow, and legalized segregation impact my life? Hugely. So I was born in 1991, and in 1993, I entered a living space where no one of color had ever lived, in the middle of Missouri. So no family, no children, no nothing. Legalized segregation. Our school superintendent called for weeks in the summer before any of me or my siblings started to attend school to beg that we were homeschooled, because he understood and he knew that what our experience would be terrible, and it was, and that the school system that I was then put in, because we weren't homeschooled, was totally unprepared. The educators, the kids, the parents, for their kids to go to school with Black folks. This was in the early 90s. We're not talking about 1945. We're not talking about 1935. We're not talking about 1965 or even 68 after Jim Crow laws were outlawed. And so I began what we know as our institutionalized educational system in a space where no one, child or teacher or parent or community member, was at all in support of me existing in that space. And it wasn't just me, it was me and my 7 other adopted siblings. So that's a start of how the legalized segregation. And one of the reasons why is because those folks in that community had no understanding of Black folks, or even the idea that Black and white folks would exist together in schooling, in life, because they had never experienced it to that point. And so my upbringing and my schooling was rooted in racism on a daily basis. And my teachers were unprepared to handle that, deal with it, to care about it. And I often say that if folks know me, they should be shocked that I married a white man, first and foremost. And they should be shocked that I don't walk around. And I think folks that know me on this call, I don't have this sort of I don't approach a space from a place of deep anger, but I definitely could. Because what I know of white people and what I was taught of white people is over concrete and blatant racism every day for 13 years. This is what I knew. This is our reality. When my brother asked a girl to prom, her father showed up on our doorstep with a gun. Folks entered our property and just stole things without consequence. This is the reality of living for us. And so I'll leave that there, but I just want to talk about, and I always say, I tell that story to give recognition and acknowledgement that what we're dealing with, racial segregation, racism, and trying to build racial equity, is we're so far behind where we should be, and we've not made nearly enough progress. And I tell my story purposely because we continue to live in a state where folks really believe that it's in the past. But I'm 29 years old. I just want to reiterate that. 29, I turn 30 next month. I'm not an 85-year-old woman talking about what it was like to live in 1965. And my life and my upbringing directly reflects folks who were born and raised in the 30s and the 40s and 50s. And so if you can hear from that short excerpt today, this is the work that needs to be done. And I'll say that the community that I grew up in, because we lived there and persisted and pursued, and we didn't move and we weren't ran out. And because the woman who raised me just refused. She just refused to succumb to the vitriol that we were experiencing. And one of the reasons why I am who I am today, and one of the reasons why I approach the things how I approach them today, is because she was insistent on us not reciprocating what we received. And I have a couple of friends on social media and in life who often write the quote, white folks should be happy that Black folks want equality and not revenge. And I think you can hear that and hear like, oh, that's really harsh, you know, like, why would you want revenge if we're really trying to all be in this kumbaya world together? But it's true. And so that's what I'm trying to live through my life. And that's one of the reasons why this work is important to me. And I didn't talk about why racial justice is important to me in my introduction, but it's because racial equity is important to me. And I know that we don't get there. We do not get to equity, even a little bit, if we do not achieve racial justice. So that's probably why that's most important to me. And then the legacy of slavery, the legacy of Jim Crow, and the legacy of legalized segregation impacted my life in a way that's hard to quantify in a story. Because home was my sanctuary and the world I existed in was white. And this is the same for sharecroppers and slaves. And so their only respite, their only opportunity for authenticity, for safety, even a resemblance of safety for slaves and sharecroppers was in the very small moments when they weren't laboring for someone else. And so when I look at my particular personal story, when Corey asked how it impacts my life, that's exactly how. So even in 1993 and the early 2000s, that direct reflection of only being able to have sanctuary literally in my home, not even on my property, in the same way that for slaves and sharecroppers, it was maybe not even in their home, just in moments, in small fleeting moments of personal time with their loved ones, if they were kept with their loved ones. I talked about this a long time, I won't. And so I hope that a little bit of that explains and helps you all understand the work that we have to do in regards to anti-Blackness.
Thank you, Whitney, for that. Just, a couple of everything you said resonated with me. And, one thing that I've learned is that we must think of this as a system. So we get so bogged down in protecting who I am, what I'm not, what I do, the nice things I do for people, the people I sleep with, the children that are brown, all of these things. And the piece about revenge reminds me of what Cornel West says. So I study because I was taught not to study. I study Malcolm X because I was taught to misunderstand Malcolm X, right? I was taught that he was angry and violent. I never saw him that way in my adult life. But he says that one thing is true about Black people and their economic and social degradation and exploitation is that they're taught to suffer peacefully, right? Suffer peacefully, one thing. And Cornel West says that, we could take all of Black people, non-white people, and put them together and allow them to be as hateful, as mean, as vindictive as possible. That would still not create disparity for white people. So it's not about behaviors, people. So it's not about individual acts. It's about a system, because collectively in 2015, 1,000 people had more wealth than 95 million people. And those 95 million people were Indigenous, Hispanic, and Black combined. So political power, economic wealth, and social power, collectively, we would still not, even if we wanted that mindset, we would still not be able to disadvantage the white race. So I say that because through it all, justice is love. And rightfully so, anger has a place in every conversation. It's just the conversation about race that we choose to say, not here. But if you don't see me, that means you definitely don't see Whitney's mother, Whitney's grandmother, Whitney's community, her ancestors, right? And if you don't see me, that means you're not in a relationship well enough to see how I see you. And that takes me to Mika, because I always find it interesting that America, through coercion and violence, history will teach us that they transferred 55% of Mexico's land, right? Transferred. but there was a Mexican war, right? The battle of Hidalgo, right? And so there were only a few states that were transferred in that. And I'm often curious why America, through that war, didn't take all the land. But Mexicans are Americans, right? So we talk about immigration, and we're talking about people who are home. This is home. And so Mika, that brings me to the question about your diaspora and journey in these United States when it comes to race and racism. So we know that the 1790 Immigration Act really still impacts us today. Power, economics, and policies get to dictate who is a citizen, who's free, who's not. And I'm still baffled by how, one, Hispanics are not considered a race. Two, how the Asian and Pacific Islander racial categorization changed 4 times in the 19th century, right? Who does that? Who got to do that? And so my question to you is, how does those policies and practices, collective practices, not individual practices, collective practices, influence relationships between Mexican Americans and our human service systems today?
Thank you, Corey. Yeah, and when you're talking about my diaspora with Mexican and my Mexican roots, my mother is 3rd generation American, Mexican American. So it's interesting the way in which we talk about that, because my family on my mom's side comes from Texas, and Texas was one of the states and one of the lands that was stolen by the United States. And we, at the time, I mean, at one point in our family lineage, one day we were Mexican and the next day we were American. You know, our flag was taken away from us, our languages was taken away from us. And so my mom is now considered, I think, 4th generation American. So that's 5th generation on my mom's side for me. On my dad's side, he is an immigrant from Mexico. And so living in those 2 different households, like I was living in one household with 2 very different cultures. While we spoke the same language, we ate similar foods, it was very different, right? But the system doesn't see us differently. That's the thing. The system does not see us differently, does not see if somebody is American or is not American. And they just lump anybody who looks Latino, of Latino descent, and creates these like racial inequalities in these policies. You know, we can talk about the passages of the anti-immigrant policies. They have very been linked to heightened levels of discrimination in our communities. You know, like bills such as the one that was passed in Arizona. And I'll talk about this one particularly because it personally affected me. I went to school at Arizona State University and I lived in Phoenix for 8 years. And this one passed in 2010, a bill called Senate Bill 1070, which essentially granted law enforcement unprecedented latitude to detain people if there was reasonable suspicion that they may be in the country without documentation. So under what grounds could you could essentially pull anyone over? You can arrest anyone simply because they looked undocumented, right? And if we're talking about our families, the difference between our families, there's no difference in skin colors in our families. So essentially any American on my side could have been pulled over, could have gotten arrested, which did happen. It happened to many families while I was living in Arizona. And there were a lot of like different strategies on who got to drive the car, at what time do you go? Do you stop going to church? Because the law enforcement at that time would wait after the Spanish masses and after the Spanish church service, and then would pull people randomly because they were doing some kind of checkpoints, right? Immigration checkpoints. And so churches became completely empty. The grocery stores became completely empty. And then that placed a lot of responsibility on the children who were actually US citizens. If they happened to get pulled over, if they happened to get arrested, at least they had the documentation to prove that they were here legally. So there's a heightened fear for deportation and unfair treatment experienced in our communities, particularly in recent immigration and immigrant anti-immigrant laws and rhetoric about who we are. Like if we just talk about the recent political climate, we heard things like when Mexico brings its country, when Mexico sends people to this country, they're not sending their best. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're bringing rapists. So ideologies about one particular subset of a population have huge implications towards the way family and children, systems who serve family and children operate and how they impact the people of color. I mean, we just talked about this. Look, the primary function of the criminal justice system was established in the Jim Crow era to preserve racial order, and it still remains in these systems. We can talk about the child welfare system, for example. The racial disparities exist, and we know that a lot of families of color are more likely to be abused or neglected, are no more likely to be abused or neglected than white families, right? But there is an overrepresentation of certain racial and ethnic populations in the child welfare system that show disparities, racial disparities based on different points, decision-making points in the case, right? And so we have to critically analyze the way in which professionals are making these reports and the ambiguities in the evaluation that determine the outcome of these systems. And it also allows for professionals' personal biases that impact the decision making, you know, because of the rhetoric that we've been fed of the people who we are and the culture and the ways that we live. When we have professionals in these systems, they're placing a lot of their personal bias, right, on decision making in any point in the decision making process that can have huge implications on families. You know, we see a removal of home or removal of children from the home and placement. A lot of there's a lack of report with systems just simply due because we are afraid of any kind of report to law enforcement then links us to having been reported to immigration law enforcement, right? So there's like this huge fear of deportation of anybody reporting any kind of neglect or any kind of report toward or abuse towards children. And so there is an under reporting that's happening in the Latino community, right? Other things that have huge impacts on this is just the way that we live. We live with families, we live in large families, we live together, right? But there's like a lack of affordable housing. So the fact that several families are living in one household has some kind of racial bias towards the way that we live, and even the intergenerational living, having grandparents and aunts and uncles all in one family, what that looks like. So yeah, these policies definitely impact the way that the professionals are making decisions for families and for children, and just simply from what Whitney shared and what Ty shared, these policies don't go away, and it's embedded in these social workers, it's embedded in the professionals, it's embedded in the people who are making these policies and procedures on what they deem to be appropriate and living conditions, right?
Thank you so much. So I trust every feeling in community is what I'm hearing can be linked to a policy, a program, a practice, right? And those policies are a compilation of laws and procedures that infuse and fuel our thinking, whether we see it that way or not. And I sort of get a chuckle when I hear the disclaimer about Latina and Latinx and Hispanic and especially Mexican individuals about their behavior and their criminality and their sexuality, all of these things that we've heard over the past 2 decades, especially in the past 4 years. I want us to remember something, that the king was not on that boat and said, hey, let's just go travel across the transatlantic for a voyage on a rickety big old ship and have a good time as we find Americas. No, the worst of the worst came over here and colonized. The worst of the worst. The king was not there. Royalty was not there. These people were running from religious persecution and were sold into indentured servitude. So our colonizers were not the brightest and the best people in the world. They weren't benevolent. They were busy trying to run around and find a witch to burn. Not the smartest lot of people we're talking about. And maybe that's why we have some of these twisted policies that we have, because we sent the worst of the worst from Europe to come and conquer something that wasn't theirs in the first place. Julie, I am so curious to know from your perspective. So in White Body, you're hearing this and you're also in the battle for justice, right? So knowing you, I know that none of this is like personal. You understand it's a system. But building from the legacy of the theft of land, slavery, some of the nuanced policies that continue to perpetuate whiteness, and we can look at, if you do your own investigation, we can look at all policies from the first 1790 immigration legislation up to even affirmative action 1961. All of those policies have advantaged white people. Each and every one of our policies, the New Deal, the housing, education policies, we got one in there, civil rights, but that just allowed us not to call people, you know what, in public, right? And it took a piece of legislation to tell white America, let these people into public places, they're human. But it never took a legislation to let humans know that we're human, right? Like, so who was that legislation for? Now, all of that combined, it sets us up, Julie, with this conversation about whiteness, white supremacy, white superiority, the things that we don't care to really talk about and examine. So based on those historical occurrences, how has that shaped your identity and current views of yourself and institutions when it comes to white superiority, and set the stage that has been set to really look at this white advantage gap? And when I say white advantage gap, I just want to give the data people a different view. What I mean by that is it's that white Americans across all systems, and if you had the workshop, you'll have the groundwater data. White people across all systems have only a 25 to 60% chance at a worse outcome than Black people. Just to say it another way, right?
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And I also appreciate how you've laid out the history, because I think that's so important to understand. And so one of the things that I like to keep in mind and share with others is that there has been an intergenerational transmission of racism and white superiority. So there's epigenetics of racism that have been passed down to us white people, and that are being passed down to our white children. So just like when you think about trauma, if you think about, going 3 generations back, if there was somebody that was substance abusing in that generation, there's been an impact on subsequent generations. And so there's also been an impact of the intergenerational transmission of racism and white superiority. Racist thoughts and ideas are passed down either overtly or covertly. And yeah, I used to think it was more covertly, but I don't believe that anymore either. I think it's both. Additionally, different from children of color who know they are brown at Black at a very young age because it's important for their survival. White kids don't grow up in families where we're told we're white, right? So I knew I was a girl, I knew I was Catholic, and I knew I was Irish, but nobody ever said, "Hey, Julie, you're white." So we know race in terms of the race of others, and we only see race in others, not ourselves. So the process establishes whiteness as invisible. So when we talk about, we talk about diversity from us instead of focusing on our whiteness. Diversity is everybody but me because I'm white. Diversity refers to everybody but me, except I'm in this member of this included group. So I'm not diverse, everybody else is. And it leaves people of color to teach white people about their whiteness and how they're being affected, which is a burden that is not theirs to carry, because it's white people that I believe have the power to dismantle the system that we're in. So the invisibility of whiteness promotes that lack of interrogation of our whiteness. That is so critical, I believe, for us to do better and be better. So we have to start consciously thinking about how whiteness shows up, how white supremacy culture shows up, how white superiority shows up in all aspects of our life, and begin to call it out, not wait for other people of color to call it out for us. And I just want to say too, that white folks typically want to have a conversation based on the present, whereas the past is the present for people of color. I mean, people are dying today and yesterday and the day before. And when we deny our privilege, we deny access to resources for those that need it. We are all complicit with maintaining structural racism. If we're not, standing up and speaking up and actively engaging in behaviors that address it, we're complicit. And when we have a system that tolerates biases, we will see disparities. I really appreciated what Mika had to say about the child welfare system, which I've spent my entire career in. There is definitely disproportionality and overrepresentation in ways that just aren't right. So I think an important concept here is racial suppression, which is the systematic effort to deny or downplay the significance of race. And one of the tools of racial suppression is failure to name white or whiteness. So rather than talk about white spaces, we'll talk about lack of diversity. We do that in our organizations when we say, well, our staff isn't very diverse, even though we're serving a large number of people of color. So I believe we have to name whiteness in all the places where we live and work and interact, and challenge the impact of white supremacy culture on ourselves and others. And there is a great article written by Tima Okun about white supremacy culture, where like some of the characteristics that she calls out that show up in organizations are perfectionism, sense of urgency, defensiveness, quantity over quality, worship of the written word, only one right way, paternalism, either or thinking, power hoarding, fear of open conflict, individualism, progress is bigger, having more is better, objectivity, and the right to comfort, which is, I see a lot with white folks. These conversations are challenging, and it's okay for us to be uncomfortable in them, because we're still safe. So yeah, I'm conscious of the time. It's the white person that I am, so I know we're running out of time, and I know the last question is important too.
Wow, lots of good stuff, and I wish we had so much more time. So we're looking at what, 10 minutes. Which way should we go, team? So that is the decision. Let's do this. Let's just do a free for all. How about that? Based on, so there's been, yeah, Danny or Donnie, yeah, that gets me off the hook. Let's just do free for all. So based on the energy today, and I see that there's been some chat conversation, just what is a couple of things you, outside of recognizing that you are a resource in the state, right? So I wanted to elevate that reach out to you, not to burden you to do the work, but to lean on one another. What is something you just want to get out there into the space about anti-racism, social justice, looking at things differently, even how you've been impacted by whiteness? Because I'm in Black body. I know whiteness well. That whole list that Julie went down, that's how I'm trained in organizations. That's how I'm taught to be, right? So what's something you really want to say to us before we wrap up our time today?
It's I realize that a lot of my like white relatives want checklists on how to be better white folks or how to be better allies or how to be better insert tagline or insert trending word. But it's simple. Build community, right? And build community where you are challenged in your thought process. Build community where folks will hold up a mirror for you about your own behavior in these systems of privilege and white supremacy. And then more importantly, don't show up in spaces of folks of color telling us how aghast you are at racism. Go show up in rooms full of white folks and tell them how aghast at racism you are. And then have those conversations. What are y'all reading? How are you consuming media, social and film or otherwise? Are you disrupting your family meals to have these really difficult conversations? Because Breonna Taylor never gets to have a Thanksgiving ever again. She never gets to have a Christmas ever again. And the only thing she was doing was sleeping at home in her bed. Have hard conversations with your family. You are already in community with those people. And sometimes Thanksgiving is a questionable event anyway about whether or not we should, one, should be celebrating it, and two, should be enjoying, like, are we enjoying ourselves with these families? So really build community and have conversations with your people that you're already with. And sometimes it's as simple as watching a film and discussing it. Sometimes it's a little bit more complicated and nuanced, like reading some of the book suggestions that I've dropped and having a book club about it. That's where these changes are going to take place. And here's the other piece that I'll put on your checklist. White folks don't get to determine what is and isn't racist. White folks don't get to determine what I am and am not offended by when it comes to racism and white supremacy. Like those are full caps, all caps, full stop. Like there is no arguing those points. And then the last piece to this, we don't do anti-racism to make people feel bad. This isn't some game that we're playing. It's not, some accolade that we're trying to put on our resume. What we're doing is making sure that our babies and our babies' babies live in a community where this alienation and this ostracization and this dehumanization is something that they will never, ever have to feel. They will never have to fear for their own lives living in the bodies that they were born into. That's why I do this work, because it's intergenerational and it has far-reaching impacts into generations. Whether I convince you today to understand me, Liz, whether I help you, you and I get on the same page, that really at the end of the day is not the goal. The goal is that the descendants of our descendants live and thrive in a way where these conversations are completely irrelevant. So that's what I'll offer in the end here. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Let's just go around. Whitney, Mika, then Julie. Let's just wrap it up.
Oh, this is really hard work. And to be frank, I've been Black all my life, but I'm pretty new to inclusion, equity, racial justice work in a public facing standpoint like this. And it's the hardest work I've done because it's so exhausting. It's so exhausting trying to show up as authentic as possible and make sure that folks hear what we're trying to say. It's absolutely exhausting trying to figure out a nice way to say that racism is bad, that white supremacy reigns. Because every time we show up and do this work, someone is offended, someone is frustrated, someone is telling us that our literally our lived experience, the way that we exist in society is not true in the way that we're saying it is. And so, one, I have a huge appreciation for all the folks who are here today and showing up with a mind and a heart and a desire to really listen. And two, I just greatly desire that you take away something from today and that it moves you to do better in your personal life, in your work life, and especially in your work life. Because my concern moving into this year and beyond is that a lot of folks have done some deep looking and some at their selves and their families. But where we need to see massive and sweeping change is our institutions. So doing what you can, writing to the legislator, talking to your higher ed institutions, and making the changes you need to make as a leader or as a worker in your workspace is huge. And doing tough conversations really, really well to the best of your ability is really important in that work too. All right, I'll be done.
Thank you, Whitney. For me, yeah, this is like really hard work. It's really, really hard work. We don't get to turn off when we don't want to do racial equity work. We don't get to say, I'm tired, I'm going to close the book, I'm going to close that toolkit that you all want, I'm going to turn the TV of that video that you watched. We don't get to do that. So this is really hard work. The most rewarding part of this work, though, for me, however, is that I'm sorry, there's going to be a train that's going to pass by because I live right in front of the train tracks. So if you hear it, that's what's happening. The most rewarding thing about this work is that I know that I have a role in healing not only my descendants, but my ancestors as well. Like, it's my responsibility. I know that I'm doing this work for a reason. This is my purpose, because they didn't get the opportunity that I have now to do that. And so that has been the most rewarding piece of this. Another thing is that know that if you want to be on this journey on decolonizing your ideologies and your thoughts and your way of being, it's a journey. It's a long journey. It's a way of being. It's not just reading a book. It's not just watching those videos. It's not just having one or two conversations with any of us, or it's not having that one Black friend or the one Latina friend. It's a way of being, and it's hard work. And so I invite you to be part of this hard work with us, because we don't get to turn it off. And so we invite you into this journey too.
And I would just add, we need to be able to hold spaces and conversations in the face of hostility and develop thick skin. We have, as white people, the most privilege, therefore we have the greatest responsibility to hold that in the relationship and be able to listen. we struggle to move the needle on race because we are so careful and cautious in these conversations. But as white people, we can hold other white people accountable. And it's easy for whites not to attribute what they do to race. For example, I hear people say, I don't have a racist bone in my body. But to me, that would be like telling the dentist that I don't have a cavity, I don't see it. It's impossible to be born white and not grow up thinking you're superior. White people don't question when there are only white presidents or a white Congress or a white Jesus. We are socialized not to talk about race, which has made us less proficient at it. And we have so little practice engaging in these conversations, and our lack of knowledge reinforces that lack of practice. So we just have to start practice and stepping into it, and interrogating our own whiteness. We're so socialized to be other focused and obsessed rather than self-reflective. But this lack of interrogation makes it easy for white people like me to say that this has nothing to do with race. And when we do nothing, we really do reinforce the prevailing order.
So I will just end by saying that I'm gonna just build on what Ty said. The allegiance isn't to like be liked, right? And to be form and fuzzy with everybody. I think the goal is truly justice. And one of the things that makes this really, really tough in all bodies is that we don't have a blueprint, because justice has never been achieved. We don't have any benchmark of what that looks like. It's only a mere aspiration today. And so being trained, you have your degrees, your position, and your power to make things happen. And one of the hardest things to recognize is that you don't have the answer for this one, right? And that it takes others to really help you with that. So my final point is just to continue to one, love yourself and understand that freedom has multiple dimensions. And I'll just elevate two. Freedom is not only the choice to make decisions, but it's also the choice to create decisions. Until everybody is free and can create opportunities and decisions, then I believe we're closer to justice at that point. But when there are members of our community, of our state, regardless of how minuscule the population of Black or non-white people are in Idaho, when they're suffering, we suffer too. This is not a one-off thing, right? It's like targeted universalism. When there's a wheelchair ramp in an urban street corner, if my knee's hurting that day, I benefit from that too, right? We all benefit from justice. So I'll just say thank you for the invitation, Roger and team, and all of you for setting space, right? Creating space and making a choice to think about things differently. And whatever you carry on, I just know that there's somebody there with you to walk this journey with. Panelists, if there isn't anything else, I mean, much love to you all for your hearts and souls.
Mika, Ty, Whitney, Julie, Corey, thank you so much for sharing of yourselves, of contributing to this, of engendering the kind of conversation that we need to be having a lot more. I really appreciated what Mika said about, it's a long journey and all of us have lots of work to do. Hopefully people don't want to end that work now. They want to start that work now or continue that work now. So there's in the evaluations, there's an opportunity to say you'd like to continue this discussion. We'll figure out what the follow-up to that might be. These four folks who are in Idaho are a resource to us. Frankly, Corey's a resource to us as well. And I hope we can continue to use them in ways that help to further this conversation, you know, into the future. I mean, this really is about our kids, you know, this is about the future. This is about, you know, what our kids, their kids, you know, to the point at some point where we can say we live in a beloved community and we don't have to continue to, you know, struggle through all these things that someday we'll have struggled through them, or some generation down the road, unfortunately. I'm going to just end with a couple of quotes, and then again, thank you all for your amazing participation and for all the parts and pieces of this conference and what it has, you know, hopefully inspired and taught, and whatever, you know, we do in conferences, it helps to set us in motion for another you know, well, another year, but hopefully it's just a continuation of the work we need to be doing. Do your evaluations. I'm sorry I have to keep saying that, but we hope you will. They do help us to understand what's best in this, you know, keep this conversation going. So like I said, I'm going to just end with a couple of quotes, you know, thanking all of you for being part of this. I've had on my board for the last while a quote from Maya Angelou, who says, "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again." And, you know, I hope maybe that's some of what we heard today. Hopefully that's some of what you heard. And then I'm going to end with a little Mr. Rogers. We live in a world in which we need to share responsibility. It's easy to say it's not my child, not my community, not my world, not my problem. Then there are those who see the need and respond. I consider those people my heroes. That's all of you. So thank you.